And it used to be public relations. When people thought about public relations, they thought Tylenol. They thought Union Carbide and Bhopal. They thought Exxon Valdez. And whenever public relations made its way into the mainstream media, it was around one of these crises. Okay? It wasn't the mundane stuff we do in PR day in and day out. Let's start off. What is a crisis? What makes a crisis? I mean, today.
Well, it's interesting. I think that what makes a crisis today for me is different than what made a crisis for me, say, 5 years ago. And we were talking about this before it started, and we basically said, well, when my blood pressure reaches a certain level, that's when we've got a crisis situation. Because when you think about a crisis, you think about, well, what are the elements of it? Normally, it's sudden. It occurs very quickly. It requires urgent attention. It's something that demands that you pay attention to it. Oftentimes, although not always, it's unexpected. There's certainly times when we try to go through and we anticipate what the crises could be and plan for them accordingly, and we've done that a lot. Unfortunately, it never seems that those are the ones that actually end up happening. And I think that those are a lot of the elements that make for a crisis. It's something that happens quickly, it's something that demands attention, and I would also say it's something that's going to have a negative effect on your corporate reputation. When I think back to some of the other things that have happened over the course of the last year, on November 5th, for example, the day after Election Day, we had printed twice the number of papers that we normally would because we knew that there would be a lot of demand for the printed newspaper. As it turns out, by about 9 o'clock in the morning, we ran out of papers. So in some ways, you could say, well, this is a crisis. I didn't feel that way. We had lines around our building. I ended up doing 3 television interviews and 2 radio interviews. In the audience tonight are some members of my team. Some of them were on Twitter that day giving updates on what was happening in terms of our getting papers to our readers. So in my mind, that wasn't a crisis. It was an event. We dealt with it, but it wasn't something that was going to adversely affect us. On the other hand, I will tell you that about 5 years ago or so, I was sitting at my desk one afternoon, and I got a call from Howie Kurtz, a reporter at the Washington Post, and he said to me, you know, I'm looking at this article that was on the front page of your paper today, and I think actually one of your reporters plagiarized what's in that article. And it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I said, well, Howie, you know, we're getting ready to wrap up the paper for the day. Everyone's going into the page 1 meeting where we discuss what's going to be on the front page the next day. I don't know if I can get back to you tonight. And he said, well, you know, that's all right. See what you can do and get back to me tomorrow if you can't. And at that moment, I didn't know whether or not we had a crisis on our hands. I didn't, quite honestly, think so, because I couldn't imagine one of our reporters plagiarizing, but in fact we did. So sometimes it's hard to even know when you have one on your hands and when you don't.
Darcy, Comcast has learned a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. There have been viral videos about Comcast. There have been disgruntled. And I suppose any consumer-facing company, you tend to be prone to that, right?
That is true. Although I will say that when I first started out in my career, and particularly in corporate communications, much of how I defined crisis was around a financial crisis. And mostly had to do with if we were buying a company or merging or selling. It just happened to be the perspective that I had, and that's generally what rose to the top of crisis, because the impact of a financial crisis is so drastic on your stock. And then we bought AT&T 5 years ago, and all of a sudden we went from being maybe the 3rd largest cable company in America to being the 1st largest, 24 million customers. The internet, from a consumer standpoint, kicked in. And I would say my definition of a crisis now is very different and is very consumer-oriented. If we have an employee that dies, to electrocution or whatever, that is horrible and it's sad. It is no longer a crisis in my book, whereas maybe 4 years ago that would have been a crisis. Now, if one of our technicians falls asleep, maybe you guys have seen this on YouTube, in a customer's home, and the customer films it and then puts it on YouTube. And
puts music to it.
I was just going to say, it puts music to it, and it just takes off. So we have a crisis probably every other day of what I would consider a crisis, where we have to get on the blogs right away. We have to get on the blogs right away and try and manage it, kill it, tell the truth, tell what's accurate and what's not accurate, because there's so much that's not accurate. And we have to be on Twitter and, you know, all sorts of other blogs. And we do that round the clock. And I pretty much don't hire anyone on my team any longer unless they have blogging experience. And that doesn't mean just looking at a blog. I mean, it has to be someone who has the experience of knowing how to blog, that has the courage, because it's very scary when you're as old as I am and you haven't been trained in blogging, and all of a sudden you have to go and say, well, here's what happened, and tell it in a way that in my previous years I might have talked on background to a print reporter or even a producer and say, okay, here's what happened, but you can't quote me. You know, when you're blogging, it's real.
I'll tell you, for those, and I know there are a lot of students here, and probably a lot of them are wondering where they're going to end up working, but if you were to look at public relations, I'd say one of the biggest growing areas is the area of being internet savvy, being social media savvy, being fluent in some of the channels through which PR people are now finding themselves working much more frequently. Marcia, you work at an agency, and you would think that working on the corporate side, maybe the crises tend to be more of the same, and working on the agency side, they tend to be much more far afield because you're working with a lot of different industries.
That's right. I think in any given day, I mean, I was trying to think, in any given day, I can start out with a high-profile divorce. I can start out with an investigation by Andrew Cuomo into a company. I can start out with a CEO who's having an affair, and therefore the board has lost its confidence in him. I can go from a restaurant where someone has gotten food poisoning. I can go from a disgruntled employee who was laid off and said that they were laid off because of age discrimination. And that's just until 10 a.m. So,
and it's all the same person.
So, you know, the one thing that is a constant, that crises like that happen all the time. I mean, it's happened through the years. I've happened to have worked at Rubenstein for 31 years now, so I certainly have seen the change in the media. Those divorces still happen, but because of the rise of the Internet, there's now all kinds of gossip sites, you know, from Gawker to TMZ to the Smoking Gun, where there is so much more information out there and so much incorrect information out there that whereas a crisis the crisis can come and go more because they're always on to the next thing. Everybody's for the next, you know, big scoop. And on the other hand, though, a crisis can go from one place and then just emanate to different sites all over the place. And when it starts getting farther and farther afield, somewhere along the line, the truth gets lost. And in each case, we have to deal with it in a different way.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about that and how the Internet has changed it. Because some people think that the 24/7 news cycle makes people more fickle and less, and the story disappears. And a lot of PR people say, well, let's just leave it alone and it'll go away. And when do you leave it alone? When don't you leave it alone? We'll explore that in a minute. So James, talk a little bit about your life and why you like being a crisis manager.
Why do I like being a crisis manager? It's a chess game, really. You know, back to your earlier question of how do you define crisis management? Well, as Senior Vice President of Crisis Management, I better have a good answer for that. The way we define it is it's when an event or an occurrence happens that thrusts a company into a fishbowl of scrutiny where the viability or the reputation of the company is threatened. first point I want to make, because these questions may come up, that's a little different than issues management. Issues management, as we define it as reputation managers, is when you have a long-term gap, right? Some audience thinks you should be here on an issue, your corporation is here on an issue. That gap is the size of the issue. And there's two things you could do to close that gap. You either make some changes or you communicate to build context. For the purpose of this discussion, I think we're going to stay focused on crisis management, which are those events that happen that thrust you into the fishbowl of scrutiny. And to tie it back to what we're here to talk about, that fishbowl has grown very, very large because you have citizen journalists, because you have bloggers, because of the 24/7 news cycles that Peter mentioned. So what do I like about it? Getting back to your question, the challenge is becoming ever more great. I think that whereas some things have changed dramatically, and I think we're going to explore that at some length here, tactically, the good news, I think, is that strategically, things really haven't changed much at all. I think the three things that most great crisis managers do very well, the mindset that they bring to any crisis, is three things: credibility, focus, and imagination. And if you can really focus on those three things and get those three things across in any crisis, you're in a pretty good shape, no matter whether it's a real world or a virtual world or real media or virtual media. So